In royal families, the dangerous man is not always the one with the crown in sight. Sometimes it is the handsome cousin in the second row, smiling as if he has nothing to prove, while quietly spending a lifetime proving otherwise. Prince Michael of Kent entered the world with every advantage that makes ordinary people sigh. He was born royal, born elegant, born into one of those families where portraits glare from panelled walls, and every nursery seems to come with a dynasty attached. But from the beginning there was a crack in the picture, and that crack mattered. Michael was not born to be king. He was not even born close enough for anyone to organize their life around his future. He was born near the centre of power, but not inside it. In a royal family, that can be the loneliest place of all. He arrived in July of 1942 at Coppins, the Kent family home in Buckinghamshire, in the middle of a war, and in the middle of one of the most complicated royal networks Europe had ever produced. His father was Prince George, Duke of Kent, the glamorous younger son of George V. His mother was Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, one of those exquisite but accoutrement imported brides who made British royalty look more continental, more polished, more expensive. On both sides the bloodlines curled through palaces and fallen courts. There were Danish links, Greek links, Russian links, enough titled relatives to make any family tree look like lace. And then, just weeks after Michael was born, his father was killed in an air crash in Scotland. That fact sits over the whole story like a dark hat at a summer wedding. Michael never knew his father. Not really. He inherited him as a legend, which is far less comforting than inheriting a living man. Prince George had been charming, restless, complicated, famously attractive, and surrounded by gossip, even in an age when the upper classes treated scandal like upholstery. He was one of those men who drew stories to himself. Women adored him. Men admired him or competed with him. He moved through society with that dangerous ease that looks like confidence and often hides appetite. So Michael grew up with a ghost for a father, and not a simple ghost either. Not a saintly war hero, so much as a romantic royal myth. It is hard for any boy to compete with a dead handsome man. It is harder still when the dead man is a prince, and the family would prefer the myth to the truth. His mother Marina did what royal widows have always done when grief and protocol arrive together. She remained poised, she remained useful. She raised her children under the relentless pressure of rank, duty, and appearances. Michael was the youngest of the three, with an older brother, Edward, who would inherit the dukedom, and an older sister, Alexandra, who would become one of the most reliable working royals of her generation. There is something almost cruel in that arrangement. The oldest son inherits the name. The daughter finds a purpose. The younger son must invent himself. That problem shaped Michael before the public ever noticed him. As a little boy, he was there for history without being history. At the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten in 1947, young Michael served as a page boy. It sounds charming, and of course it was. Tiny tartan, solemn faces, the lovely theatre of monarchy restoring itself after war. But there he was, even then, in the perfect position that would define his life. Close enough to be in the picture, not important enough to change it. His first cousin Elizabeth would become Queen Elizabeth II, one of the most disciplined women to occupy any throne in the modern age. Michael, by contrast, grew up as the sort of royal who could easily be overlooked by the public and never quite overlooked by the family. That sounds comfortable, but it is not. The British royal family knows exactly what to do with a monarch, a direct heir, a dutiful spare, even a scandalous rebel. What it has never quite known what to do with is a second son of a second line who still has royal blood in his veins, a style before his name, and expensive expectations attached to. Both. He was educated as such. Boys were educated. Sunningdale, Eton, Sandhurst, a route paved with discipline, hierarchy, and polished shoes. Michael was by all accounts intelligent, well-mannered, and linguistically gifted. He learned French, picked up other languages, and developed a serious interest in Russian. That part was not a passing hobby. It mattered. His grandmother on his mother's side had been Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, and the Romanov connection fascinated him. In a family addicted to ancestry, Michael had a particularly romantic branch to cling to. Russian imperial history offered him something British court life did not. It gave him drama, tragedy, and perhaps, most importantly, distinction. He became the first member of the British royal family to learn Russian seriously, later qualifying as a military interpreter. That sounds like a detail for a biography, but in Michael's life, details often turned into identity. He was never going to be the central British royal. He could, however, become the royal with the Russian face, the Russian interest, the Russian contacts, the Russian stories. Over time, that personal fascination would become one of the most important and troubling themes in his public life. But early on, it looked almost noble. Here was a prince doing something unusual, something intellectual, something with a real edge of expertise rather than decorative ribbon-cutting. He entered Sandhurst in the early 1960s and was commissioned into the 11th Hussars. The army gave him what royalty alone could not. It gave him a profession, structure, a chain of command, a way to be judged, at least in theory, by competence rather than merely by blood. For men born in awkward royal positions, the military has often functioned as a rescue line. It offers dignity without requiring inheritance. Michael served in Germany, Hong Kong, and Cyprus, and also worked on the Defence Intelligence Staff. He retired with the rank of Major after a military career that lasted roughly 2 decades. Now, if this were the story of a straightforward and trusted prince, that would be the perfect foundation. Early loss, stoic mother, good schools, military service, polished manners, foreign languages, public reserve. It should have produced a safe pair of hands. It should have produced one of those lesser royals the public vaguely likes, because they seem serious and do not make a nuisance of themselves. But the problem with Michael was never appearance. The problem was always the gap between appearance and arrangement. Because while he looked every inch the ideal royal gentleman, his actual position inside the institution was unstable. He was royal enough to need the lifestyle, but not royal enough to have it straightforwardly funded. His brother, the Duke of Kent, had a formal role. His sister, Alexandra, became a dependable public servant for the crown. Michael occupied a more peculiar category. He occasionally represented the Queen abroad. He could appear at family events in all the proper uniforms. He lived amid the symbols of monarchy, but he was not a full working royal in the way the public understands the term. He did not receive the kind of state-backed support people imagine when they hear the word prince. In plain English, he had the title, the expectations, and the costs, without the clear financial structure. That is where suspicion begins in stories like this. Not with a crime, not even with a scandal, with an incentive. A prince who has everything is usually dull. A prince who has just enough to look grand and not enough to feel secure can become very interesting indeed. By the 1970s, Michael was a grown man in a family where his cousin was queen. His status was real, and his future was still oddly undefined. Britain itself had changed. The old post-war deference was thinning. The magic of monarchy remained, but the practical business of being a minor royal had become less simple. Appearances still had to be maintained. Homes had to be run. Staff cost money. Clothes cost money. Travel cost money. The public liked glitter but could turn nasty the moment it suspected someone else was paying for it. And into that already delicate picture stepped the woman who would turn Prince Michael into half of one of the most discussed and least trusted couples on the royal fringe. Her name was Marie Christine von Reibnitz, a German-born, aristocratic, Roman Catholic beauty with a continental background so rich in titles it practically rustled. She was not the sort of woman who melts into the wallpaper, and she was certainly not the sort of woman British courtiers find relaxing. By the time Michael met her, she had already lived a life interesting enough to irritate people. She had style, opinions, a first marriage behind her, and the kind of confidence that can look glamorous from across a ballroom and alarming from across a palace office. There are women who marry into the British royal family by presenting themselves as soothing. Then there are women who arrive like a challenge. Marie Christine was a challenge. That alone would have been enough to make her controversial. The family, like most old institutions, has always preferred outsiders who quickly learn the local choreography. Smile here, nod there. Do not upstage the blood royals. Never appear too foreign, too ambitious, too knowing or too certain that the old rules are ridiculous. Marie Christine had many qualities. Smallness was not one of them. Michael, of course, was drawn to her. That tells you something important about him. He was not looking for safety. He was looking for glamour, excitement, and perhaps a kind of recognition. She was not a plain little domestic answer to a royal problem. She was dramatic, worldly, and difficult to ignore. To a man who had spent a lifetime being visible but secondary, a woman like that must have felt electric. Their romance did not unfold under ideal conditions. Marie Christine had been married before to the English banker Thomas Trowbridge. She was Roman Catholic. In a less medieval country, those facts would have amounted to social chatter and perhaps a raised eyebrow from an aunt. In the British royal family of the 1970s, they mattered in ways that were both constitutional and deeply personal. Under the old rules governing succession, a royal who married a Roman Catholic lost his place in line to the throne. Michael was not about to become king, but principle in royal life has never depended on likelihood. It depends on hierarchy, faith, precedent, and what the family thinks it can. C'est vivre. There was also the matter of her divorce. For a family still carrying the scars of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, marriages that looked irregular were never just personal. They were historical triggers. They brought back old panic. They reminded the institution that romance in royal circles is never only romance. It is inheritance, doctrine, symbolism, and newspaper fodder, all mixed together like a cocktail nobody can digest. Michael married her in Vienna in 1978, in a civil ceremony. It was elegant, continental, and, from the point of view of traditionalists, deeply inconvenient. Because his bride was a Roman Catholic, Michael lost his place in the line of succession under the rules then in force. That was not a dramatic abdication in the Edward VIII sense. He was not sacrificing a throne, but the symbolism mattered. He had chosen a woman over a constitutional privilege, however remote. Some admired that, others filed it away. And the family noticed something else. Michael had not chosen a quiet life. He had chosen a woman who came with her own atmosphere. The British public would later know her as Princess Michael of Kent, a title that confused people who wanted women in royal life to have prettier, simpler labels. But by tradition, because she was not born a British princess, she took the feminine form of her husband's title. So there she was, Princess Michael, one of the most gloriously awkward names in the family, sounding less like a fairy tale heroine and more like a warning. She and Michael quickly developed a reputation that was never soft. Even before the bigger controversies came, there was that unmistakable sense around them that they were not entirely at ease in the role expected of them. They wanted grandeur, but also freedom. They wanted status, but not necessarily restraint. They wanted access to the royal world while retaining room to maneuver like private people. That balancing act is exactly the kind of thing royal families claim to hate, usually because it so often ends badly. And yet, from Michael's point of view, one can see the temptation clearly. He had not been born with a duchy to inherit. He had not been selected as a regular public workhorse. He did not receive the same sort of institutional support as relatives who had clearer jobs. If he was to maintain a princely life, he would have to create one. His official biography would later make this sound almost noble. Because he received no taxpayer funding, he ran a private consulting business. That is the tidy version. The untidy version is that a prince earning private money is exactly the sort of figure who makes old palace minds go cold. Because what is he really selling? Not a product exactly, not a skill in the ordinary sense. He is selling access, aura, suggestion, confidence, association. He is selling the possibility that a room might open more easily because he has walked into it. He is selling the oldest aristocratic commodity in the world, which is proximity dressed up as usefulness. That is the point where trust begins to fray, especially in Britain, where people pretend to despise class while endlessly measuring its privileges. Well, a minor royal can be decorative. A minor royal can be charitable. A minor royal can even be eccentric up to a point, but a minor royal who appears to monetize his mystique starts to make everyone nervous. Courtiers worry about embarrassment. Politicians worry about influence. The public worries about freeloading. Other royals worry about contagion. If one cousin turns rank into business, what stops the others? Michael did not create that fear on his own. He and his wife seemed to embody it together. She was witty, sharp-tongued, and known for saying the thing most people would have had the sense to swallow. He was smoother, more classically royal in tone, but somehow that could make the whole package feel more rather than less dangerous. She looked like trouble. He looked like respectability. It is a potent combination. One distracts, the other reassures, and between them people miss the mechanism until too late. Their home life added another layer to the picture. They had children, Lord Frederick and Lady Gabriella, and from the outside they could appear perfectly settled. Handsome family, palace address, society weddings, all the trimmings. But even in the early years there was a sense that they were what people once called poor relations, though poor in this case meant something very particular. Not poor in the ordinary sense. Poor by the standards of a family where some branches have estates, offices, inherited purpose, and clear channels of support. It is one thing to be a millionaire in Mayfair, it is another to be the less funded cousin in a dynasty that makes ordinary wealth look slightly embarrassing. That pressure can make people defensive. It can also make them inventive. And Prince Michael was inventive in precisely the way the monarchy mistrusts most. He was a man with pedigree, social ease, and a practical need to turn them into a life. He could dress like royalty, speak like royalty, move through military, diplomatic, and aristocratic circles like he belonged there because, of course, he did. But belonging is not the same as being anchored. The institution could use him when convenient, admire his polish, even let him sparkle at the edges. What it could never fully relax about was the fact that Michael lived in the blurry space between royal duty and private enterprise. That blurry space is where trouble grows. And trouble was already beginning to gather, not yet in its loudest form, but in the subtle way reputations are built inside old families. A look here, a remark there, a feeling that he and his wife were just a little too interested in the glamorous side of things, a little too comfortable with wealthy circles, a little too willing to live like major royals, while insisting they were private citizens when bills or rules became inconvenient. In royal life, distrust does not arrive all at once. It accumulates like silver tarnish. By the end of the 1970s, the essential pattern was already in place. Michael was still handsome, still polished, still carrying the melancholy romance of the father he never knew, and the Romanov ghosts he adored. He was also now attached to a wife who made people whisper, and positioned in a role that invited a particularly British kind of suspicion. Who exactly was he, institutionally speaking? A prince, a gentleman, a soldier, a cousin of the Queen, a private businessman, a representative of the Crown when needed. Not funded like a working royal, not free like an ordinary citizen. That is not a stable identity. It is a social tightrope. And when a man spends enough years on a tightrope, the watching crowd does not merely wonder whether he will fall. It begins to wonder whether he secretly enjoys the wobble. The match was already lit. By the time Marie Christine, Princess Michael of Kent, entered that Manhattan restaurant in the spring of 2004, she was not just a difficult woman having dinner. She was a reputation walking on legs. Years of clipped remarks, raised eyebrows, social frost, and whispered palace irritation had already wrapped themselves around her like a fur stole. So when reports spread that she had made an offensive remark to a group of black diners, people did not wait patiently for careful clarification. They simply nodded in that weary, unsurprised way that says, well, of course she did. She denied the worst version of the story. There were disputes over what exactly had been said and how it had been heard, but by then the precise wording hardly mattered. That was the merciless truth of the Kents. Each new uproar was received not as an isolated misunderstanding, but as another bead threaded onto a necklace the public had already been making for years. Arrogant, tone-deaf, too grand, too slippery, too pleased with themselves, too used to doors opening, too little interested in how it looked. And Michael, though not the man at the centre of that particular table-side disaster, paid for it all the same. That is one of the most important things to understand about him. He was not distrusted only for what he personally said or did. He was distrusted because he appeared to preside over a whole atmosphere in which ordinary standards somehow never quite applied. The marriage made that atmosphere thicker. His wife gave it a face and a voice, but Michael gave it legitimacy. She might scandalize. He made it seem permanent. Inside the family, this dynamic was not exactly new. Long before that New York story, people had been trying to place the couple in the correct emotional drawer, and never quite succeeding. The central royals could be reserved, difficult, proud, even petulant, but they were shielded by function. If the Queen seemed distant, she was the Queen. If Charles appeared moody, he was the heir. If Anne was blunt, she was working harder than nearly all of them. Public life forgives many things when the role is clear. Michael had no such protection. He and his wife were judged more nakedly because nobody could ever quite answer the simplest question about them. What exactly were they for? That question sounds rude, but monarchy is built on it. A royal without a purpose begins to look ornamental. A royal with ornament and appetite begins to make people suspicious. The 1980s had taught the public to look at the royal family as a grand emotional soap opera. Diana had changed everything. The old language of duty no longer covered every bruise. People wanted glamour, yes, but they also wanted feeling. They wanted sorrow they could understand, tenderness they could admire, betrayal they could recognize from their own lives. In that atmosphere, the Kents were awkwardly placed. They had the surface ingredients of fascination, beauty, rank, difficult marriage, sharp social reputation, but not the emotional accessibility that turns scandal into sympathy. Nobody ever thought Michael and his wife were suffering in a way that invited public protection. They looked too lacquered for that, too upholstered, too practiced. And yet behind the polished surfaces there were very real pressures, the kind that can turn a minor royal life into a chain of questionable choices. The palace apartment was one of them. Kensington Palace sounds romantic when tourists say it, and burdensome when accountants do. Apartment 10 was not a little grace and favour nest, with 2 armchairs and a bowl of roses. It was large, prestigious, and expensive to maintain. It placed the Kents in the heart of royal London, which suited the image they wished to project and the image the family, in some moods, wished to preserve. But it also created a permanent problem. Once you live like that, stepping down is not merely a practical adjustment, it is a public humiliation. It says the magic has thinned. It says the prince is less of a prince than people imagined. Michael was never going to embrace that sort of humiliation willingly. He had been raised in a world where surroundings were not decoration. They were language. The room you entered told people who you were. The guest list told them more. The photographs, the silver, the inherited portraits, the names on the envelopes, the ease with which you spoke to ambassadors and industrialists and old titled women with dead husbands and serious jewels, all of it formed a system. Michael understood that system very well, better perhaps than he understood the danger of trying to sustain it when the financial foundations were not simple. The arrangement at Kensington Palace became a long, simmering source of public resentment. People did not care about the constitutional niceties. They saw a prince and princess living grandly and assumed somebody else was helping foot the bill. When scrutiny grew sharper in the early 2000s, the matter became ugly. The rent they had effectively been paying was portrayed as absurdly low, especially by the standards of the London property market, and certainly by the standards of ordinary taxpayers who would have considered themselves lucky to afford a modest flat, never mind rooms in one of the royal family's most symbolically loaded residences. The defence offered on Michael's behalf was not entirely unreasonable. He and his wife were not full-time publicly funded working royals. They carried out engagements, they supported charities, they maintained a royal presence. There were explanations about private payments and later about commercial rent. But explanations are not the same thing as trust, and by then trust had already been worn thin. One should also notice what this sort of row revealed about Michael's instincts. He did not simplify. He did not retreat, cut the cloth, and adopt a visibly humbler mode of living that might have softened feeling against him. He held position. That was pure royal blood. To give way would have been to admit that the grand setting itself had become unjustifiable, better from his point of view. To insist on dignity and weather the criticism than to concede that he had been living above a station the public thought he ought to occupy. In another era, that stubbornness might have been admired as princely steel. In modern Britain it looked closer to entitlement. His wife did not help. In truth, Marie-Christine almost never helped when the issue was public warmth. She was cleverer than many of the people criticising her, better read than most of the tabloids hounding her, and fully capable of being charming when she chose. But she possessed the fatal, aristocratic habit of making it plain when she did not feel like choosing. There are women who survive in public life by appearing to like everyone just enough. She had no interest in pretending that hard. That could be refreshing in private. In public, it was destructive. Stories followed her like sparrows after crumbs. She had once worn a black sheep brooch to a lunch attended by Diana, which people delighted in reading as a malicious joke. Whether that was the true intention or not, it landed because by then everyone was ready to believe that Princess Michael of Kent would indeed wear a coded insult on her jacket if the mood took her. She gave interviews that could sound imperious. She wrote books on European history and social subjects in a tone that underlined her self-confidence rather than softened it. She seemed to inhabit rank rather than merely borrow it. And because she was so often discussed as the difficult one, Michael could slide for a time into the role of the patient husband, the smoother half of the duo, the courtly prince saddled with a wife who said too much. That reading flattered him, and it was not entirely false, but it also concealed a deeper truth. He had chosen her. He stayed beside her. He allowed the household atmosphere to be what it was. A man cannot enjoy the social voltage of a marriage and then plead innocence when the wiring catches fire. Besides, Michael had his own style of trouble. It was simply more polished. His post-military life increasingly depended on contacts, consulting, introductions, and the old aristocratic talent for turning familiarity into value. He did not present himself as a grubby hustler, and he was not one. That would have been much less unsettling. He presented himself as exactly what he had been born to present, a cultivated royal gentleman with international experience, language skills, military credentials, and deep historical interests. People who met him could easily come away impressed. He knew how to listen. He knew how to flatter without sounding oily. He knew how to make businessmen feel that their enterprise had acquired a certain dignity by being discussed in his company. That is why distrust around him was so persistent. He was believable. A vulgar opportunist announces himself too clearly and can be dismissed. Michael moved in a far more dangerous way. He made the trading of status look almost respectable, almost inevitable, even almost civic. Of course, a prince with knowledge of Eastern Europe might advise commercial delegations. Of course, a royal cousin could facilitate relationships across borders. Of course, his title opened doors, but then titles open doors everywhere, do they not? Why should he be condemned for walking through them? The answer, of course, was that most people suspected he was not merely walking through them. He was charging emotional rent on the hallway. Russia sat at the centre of this unease, though in the earlier years it still glimmered more romantically than ominously. Michael's fascination with his Romanov ancestry had always given him a glow of seriousness that other lesser royals lacked. It was a real interest, not a decorative hobby. He knew the language. He had studied the history. He cultivated relationships in Russian circles that seemed, at least initially, to make sense for a man with his background. After the fall of the Soviet Union, when British business and diplomatic society looked east with a mixture of greed, curiosity, and optimism, Michael seemed almost perfectly designed for the moment. He could stand in gilded halls, speak Russian, invoke family ties, and make modern commerce feel touched by old Europe. He was not only useful, he was atmospheric. The difficulty with atmospheric men is that they are often most vulnerable to flattery, from people who are not sentimental at all. Still, that darker chapter was not yet fully visible. In the years when post-Soviet Russia still shimmered in the Western imagination as a place of possibility rather than menace, Michael's interest looked distinguished. He attended commemorative events tied to the Romanov past. He involved himself in charitable and cultural initiatives connected to Russia. He seemed in some settings almost more emotionally alive within that history than within the more clipped and duty-bound life of his own immediate family. One can understand why. In Britain he was peripheral. In Russia he could feel almost central to a story. He could be the prince with a tragic inheritance, the man whose bloodline had outlived the bullets in Yekaterinburg, the English cousin carrying echoes of a murdered imperial world. It must have been intoxicating, and intoxication, especially the kind wrapped in ancestry and meaning, can be every bit as blinding as cash. Back in London, the family kept doing what royal families always do with troubling relatives who are not yet impossible. They tolerated, adjusted, and quietly sorted people into private categories: useful, safe, temperamental, greedy, decorative, hard work. Michael drifted more and more into that difficult category, reserved for people who are too close to exile but too royal to discard. He could still be sent to represent the Queen on some occasions. He could still appear in the proper places. but nobody really looked at him as uncomplicatedly safe. That became clearer in contrast with his siblings. His elder brother, Edward, Duke of Kent, had a more fixed place. He had inherited the title and performed years of solid, undramatic royal service. His sister, Princess Alexandra, had long been regarded as one of the most dependable and gracious members of the wider family, admired without fuss. Beside them, Michael looked less like the steady branch and more like the decorative one that might crack in an unexpected storm. Same parents, same losses, same breeding, but a very different relation to duty. Edward and Alexandra seemed to accept the terms of the institution. Michael seemed forever negotiating with them. That negotiation shaped his children too, though in quieter ways. Lord Frederick and Lady Gabriella grew up as royal relations, rather than central players, close enough to the great machine to feel its pull. Not close enough to be trapped by its main gears. Their parents clearly wanted them to belong to the world they themselves inhabited, that blend of aristocratic, royal, and international society in which names still mattered terribly. Yet even here there was ambiguity. The children had status, but no throne shaped their destiny. They had glamour, but no guaranteed purpose. It was the same half-lit territory Michael knew so well, and one wonders whether he recognized in them the very problem that had defined him from birth. Perhaps that is why he kept clinging so fiercely to appearance. If the edges of position are blurred, appearance begins to do the work of certainty. But appearances were becoming harder to control. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Britain had less patience for inherited grandeur without visible restraint. The old post-war awe had evaporated. The Diana years had taught the public that royals could bleed, sulk, betray, and scheme like anyone else. Parliament had grown bolder in questioning costs. Newspapers, especially the tabloids, had become brilliantly vicious at spotting any gap between official story and actual lifestyle. In that climate, the Kents seemed almost built to attract suspicion. Everything about them looked expensive, layered, and faintly theatrical. Everything required the public to believe that a couple living in a palace, moving through society, and carrying titles into private work were somehow not taking liberties with the very system that elevated them. People stopped wanting to believe it. And because belief was draining away, every social offence around the couple began to carry extra weight. When Marie Christine seemed rude, it was not only rudeness, it became evidence. When Michael defended a privilege, it was not only self-protection, it became proof. When the household explained itself, the explanation sounded less like clarification and more like another aristocratic memo from a world that assumed its own special case. The public can forgive almost anything except the feeling that it is being played for a fool. That was the real danger gathering around Prince Michael by the middle of the first decade of the new century. Not one singular disgrace, not one devastating betrayal, but the gradual formation of a consensus. He looked like a man who knew exactly how far he could stretch royalty without snapping it. A man who enjoyed the ambiguity between public service and private advantage because ambiguity was where all his best options lived. Too royal to be ordinary, too private to be fully accountable, too polished to be caught speaking plainly about what he wanted, and too dependent on status not to keep using it. If he had been merely decorative, nobody would have cared. If he had been plainly hard-working in a narrow, self-sacrificing way, people might have admired him. But Michael sat in the most corrosive middle ground. He appeared clever enough to benefit from the system, and aggrieved enough to complain when the system questioned him. That combination has ruined trust in many kinds of men, not just princes. By then, even sympathy for his early losses, the father dead in war, the odd place in the hierarchy, The pressure of maintaining dignity on uncertain ground had begun to wear thin. The public no longer saw a boy growing up in the shadow of a glamorous dead duke. It saw a mature prince still finding reasons why the rules should bend. It saw a wife whose every public appearance seemed to challenge the idea that rank required tact. And it saw a monarchy, always slow to learn, continuing to house and half-shield figures who made the whole institution look slippery. There was also, in Michael's case, the oldest aristocratic weakness of all. He genuinely seemed to like the company of wealthy and well-connected people. That does not make him unusual. It makes him very much what he was raised to be. But in a modern royal, that instinct needs to be hidden under layers of duty, charity, or obvious public usefulness. Michael too often let it show. He looked at ease among magnates, foreign grandees, financiers, and men whose importance came less from public honour than from private leverage. He never looked like a prince shrinking from worldly temptation. He looked like a prince who found the whole thing rather congenial. And when a man finds that world congenial, one begins to worry about who else finds him congenial in return. The difficulty for Michael was that the coming years would pose that question in harsher forms than he had yet faced. The Manhattan uproar was nasty, but it still belonged to the realm of social scandal, that glittering outer crust of insult, class, race, and public disgust. Ugly, yes, but survivable. Rent rows were embarrassing, but still domestic, still explicable. The deeper danger lay elsewhere in the long path he had already laid for himself through business, diplomacy, title, and Russian affinity. He had spent years constructing a life in which his usefulness could not easily be separated from his name. That life had given him relevance. It had also made him vulnerable to the sort of entanglements that swallow relevance whole. For now, though, the picture was already bleak enough. Within the House of Windsor, trust is not a warm embrace, it is a practical judgment. Can this person be sent, relied upon, defended, left alone, kept near money, kept near foreigners, kept near microphones, kept near the centre, without splashing mud on the walls? By that standard, Michael's stock had been slipping for years. Too many questions, too much explanation, too much life in the grey area. And the saddest part, perhaps, was that some of what made him distrusted had once looked like his best qualities. His worldliness, his independence, his intelligence, his refusal to be merely decorative, his hunger to matter somewhere. Each of those things, in a different kind of man and under a different kind of discipline, might have become an asset. In Michael they curdled into something else. The sense that beneath the exquisite manners and polished face there was always a private calculation running. That is what people mean when they say, nobody trusted him. Not that he was forever shouting or staggering or committing obvious outrages. It was worse than that. He gave the impression of understanding the value of trust very well and still spending it too freely. And before long, he would spend it in company far more dangerous than indignant diners or irritated taxpayers. The company was not dangerous at first glance. That was the trouble. If Prince Michael had wandered into truly disreputable circles in some obvious, theatrical way, red lights would have flashed at once. Palace secretaries would have fussed, newspapers would have sharpened their knives, and the whole thing might have been contained as one more foolish episode in the life of a minor royal. But the circles around him were often the kind that flatter people into carelessness. Men in good suits, women with old names and excellent cheekbones, bankers who spoke softly, fixers who preferred the word advisor, international hosts who poured very good wine and made everyone feel that history itself had chosen the seating plan. Michael had been raised to flourish in exactly that atmosphere. This is what made him so unnerving to people who watched him closely. He was not clumsy in society. He was gifted in it. He could be warm without looking eager, informed without sounding pedantic, princely without seeming to brag. He knew how to make a room feel smaller and more exclusive simply by entering it with the right degree of ease. Men with his kind of social confidence are often forgiven far too much because they do not look grasping while they are taking. And his wife, for all the trouble she caused, understood that world too. She understood rank as instinctively as some women understand weather. She knew who mattered, who did not, who should be greeted warmly, who could be cut with a smile, and how much power there was in making other people feel vaguely beneath the occasion. It was a disastrous talent for a public figure, but an extremely effective one in private society. After the New York restaurant uproar in 2004, many people assumed the couple might finally learn caution. It would have been sensible. Public opinion had turned acidic. The story had all the ingredients Britain loves to despise in its royals: bad manners, racial overtones, and the unmistakable scent of old privilege behaving as if the room belonged to it. Marie Christine denied the ugliest account of what happened. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding, but then, in trying to defend herself later, she offered one of the strangest and most self-defeating explanations imaginable. She spoke about having once darkened her hair and tried to pass herself off as African during a youthful adventure, apparently imagining this would prove she could not possibly be racist. It was one of those moments that tells you everything and nothing at once. On one level, it was absurd, almost comic in its tone-deafness. On another, it was revealing in a much colder way. It showed how little instinctive feel she had for modern public shame. Most people, after being accused of racial arrogance, would shrink, apologize carefully, and retreat. Princess Michael did what she often did when cornered. She pushed farther in, armed with her own confidence, as though the simple force of aristocratic certainty might make everyone else look silly. It almost never worked, and yet she kept trying. Michael stood beside her. He did not, of course, give the kind of lurid performance that tabloids crave. He was too disciplined for that. He did not publicly scold her, nor did he dramatically distance himself. He simply remained where he always remained, next to the trouble, polished enough not to be swallowed by it, and loyal enough to absorb some of the stain. That choice mattered. It deepened the sense that whatever private discomfort he might feel, he preferred solidarity with his wife over any attempt to reassure the wider public that he understood why people were appalled. That is one of the subtle ways trust dies in public life, not in one act of guilt, but in repeated acts of indifference to how guilt looks. Inside royal circles, the Kents had by then become exactly the sort of couple people discuss with a careful little smile. Not the central family, not the useful safe hands, not the openly ruined either. Something more tiresome than that, a recurring source of awkwardness. Courtiers dislike recurring awkwardness because it cannot be solved. It can only be managed, postponed, or rearranged around. And Michael himself kept becoming harder to sort neatly. He still had the soldierly bearing. He still had the old family tragedy behind him, the father killed in war, the strange life of being royal and yet not securely placed. He still carried himself with the excellent tailoring of a man who knows that his face and posture are part of his professional equipment, but he was now also a middle-aged prince who seemed increasingly dependent on private networks, foreign links, and social prestige to maintain the style of life he believed appropriate to his rank. That dependence gave his Russian interests a new and more complicated shape. In youth, Michael's fascination with Russia had made him seem learned and romantically historical. By middle age, it had become part passion, part identity, and part opportunity. He was not merely interested in the Romanovs as a distant family curiosity. He took the connection seriously, emotionally even. He attended the burial of Tsar Nicholas II and members of the imperial family in St. Petersburg in 1998. He cultivated his role as a royal cousin with genuine Romanov blood. He was received in Russian circles not as a vague British aristocrat, but as a man who embodied a bridge between lost empire and living monarchy. One can see exactly why he loved it. In Britain he was a cousin in the margins. In Russia he could be presented almost as a figure from history who had walked out of a photograph and into the room. He spoke the language, he knew the lineage, he looked the part. His very existence gave Russian hosts the kind of dynastic poetry that moneyed modern life cannot buy for itself. Men who were building fortunes, power and influence in the chaotic decades after Soviet collapse could wrap themselves in a little old-world legitimacy, simply by being seen with him. And Michael, in return, received something he had wanted all his life: significance. This was not just about money, though money was never absent for long. It was about status that felt active rather than inherited. It was about walking into a room and feeling that his presence had genuine value beyond courtesy. It was about becoming useful in a way the British royal family had never quite allowed him to be. Russia did not treat him as decorative. It treated him as meaningful. That can be more intoxicating than wealth. It also made him easier to use. London, in the years after the Soviet collapse, had developed a complicated relationship with Russian wealth. There was curiosity, appetite, vanity, and an almost childish love of the spectacle of money moving into old British settings. Mansions were bought, clubs were joined, charities were supported, invitations multiplied. Everybody claimed to be terribly sophisticated about the new Russia, even when what they really meant was that they enjoyed the grandness of the guests and the size of the dinners. In that world, Prince Michael fit uncomfortably well. He could lend elegance to the relationship. He could make commerce feel historical and history feel profitable. Again, one does not need a crime to see why this worried people. His formal and semi-formal ties reflected that drift. He became closely associated with the Russo-British Chamber of Commerce and other organizations designed to strengthen links between Britain and Russia. He took part in delegations and events where the language was always respectable: friendship, cooperation, exchange, partnership, culture. Those are lovely words. They are also words behind which more practical motives often hide. Whenever Michael appeared in such settings, one question hovered, even when nobody asked it aloud: is he here because of what he knows, or because of who he is? More dangerously still, can anyone tell the difference anymore? He accepted Russian warmth with perhaps a little too much visible pleasure. In 2009, he was awarded the Order of Friendship at the Kremlin for his work on Anglo-Russian relations. It was a handsome, flattering moment, one of those occasions when Michael must have felt that the threads of his life had finally woven themselves into something splendid. The boy who had loved Russian history, the officer who had learned the language, the prince with Romanov blood, the man who had built a role for himself outside the normal channels of British royalty, there he was, publicly honoured in Moscow. But what looked splendid to him looked rather different to others. By then Britain was no longer viewing Russia through quite such dreamy post-Cold War spectacles. There had already been uglier reminders of how power operated around the Kremlin and around the wealthy men who prospered near it. The atmosphere had changed. Russian money in London no longer looked merely glamorous or exotic. It began to look strategic, shadowy, politically awkward. In that climate, Prince Michael's old love affair with Russian society started to appear less charmingly historical and more faintly dangerous. He did not seem to grasp that change quickly enough. That failure was typical of him. Michael often behaved like a man whose personal understanding of his own motives should be enough to settle everyone else's doubts. If he felt honourable, then his conduct must surely be understood as honourable. If he believed he was advancing friendship, then what right had others to imply there might be vanity, profit, or carelessness mixed in with it? But public trust does not work like that. It depends less on the purity of a man's private intention than on the visible shape of his choices. And Michael's choices kept placing him in rooms where appearances turned against him. Meanwhile, at home, the marriage continued to harden into something almost operatic. Michael and Marie Christine were not one of those royal couples whose frictions melted into a mellow, companionable middle age. They remained vivid, proud and prickly. She kept the capacity to outrage. He kept the capacity to smooth, but not to fundamentally alter the impression they gave as a unit. There was always something faintly old regime about them, and not in the flattering sense. They belonged to a world of social assumptions that modern Britain no longer accepted graciously. Rank should count, presentation should count, private circles should matter, cleverness should excuse a certain amount of coldness. Being misunderstood by the public was practically a sign of breeding. It was a dangerous attitude to maintain in an age when royal survival depended increasingly on appearing emotionally literate, financially careful, and publicly self-aware. Michael had some self-awareness, but not enough where it counted. He knew he was not central. He knew he needed to earn. He knew he had to keep his dignity. But he never seemed fully willing to confront the possibility that the method by which he was preserving that dignity was itself the source of public suspicion. Instead, he often appeared almost offended that people were too vulgar to appreciate nuance. The race scandals surrounding his wife made this even worse because they cut across the very areas where the monarchy was becoming most vulnerable. Britain was changing. The Commonwealth was changing. Public conversations about race, empire, class, and inherited privilege were no longer faint mutters at the edge of national life. They were pressing inward. Every royal, especially every less essential royal, needed to move with more tact than before. Princess Michael moved with less. That is why the blackamoor brooch incident in 2017 was so devastating, even though it involved a piece of jewellery rather than a shouted insult. At the Queen's pre-Christmas lunch, where Meghan Markle was meeting more of the royal family as Prince Harry's future bride, Princess Michael arrived wearing a blackamoor brooch. Whether the choice was ignorant, careless, provocative, or some blend of all three, the effect was dreadful. Meghan was biracial. The symbolism was obvious to almost everyone watching. The brooch was read not as a harmless antique ornament, but as a piece soaked in colonial fantasy and racial insult. Princess Michael apologized afterward and said she was distressed to have caused offence, but by then the image had already done its work. And once again, Michael found himself standing beside a scandal that confirmed every ugly thing people were inclined to suspect about his household. It is hard to overstate how destructive that moment was in emotional terms, even if Michael himself was not the one wearing the brooch. By 2017, the royal family was already under growing pressure over how Meghan would be received, how race operated inside royal culture, and whether old assumptions still lurked behind polished palace walls. The Princess Michael incident became one of those episodes that seem, to the public, to pull back a curtain. Suddenly the Kents did not just look snooty or financially slippery. They looked like representatives of something older and harsher, the sort of aristocratic instinct that can smile beautifully and still make a room feel poisoned. For Michael, that was catastrophic because it narrowed the emotional space in which people interpreted him. After that, many no longer saw him primarily as the cultivated cousin with odd business arrangements and a weakness for wealthy foreign circles. They saw him as half of a household that embodied the least attractive habits of old royalty, touchy about privilege, careless about appearances, and startlingly bad at understanding the moral weather of the age. It also deepened the generational divide around him. The younger royals were trying, with varying degrees of success, to modernize the image of monarchy. Some did it through work, some through emotional openness, some simply through better instinct around the press. Michael and his wife seemed to come from another museum case entirely. One could imagine them perfectly in a grand house in 1937, surrounded by liveried servants and mildly horrifying dinner conversation. In 21st century Britain, that aura was no longer romantic, it was combustible. And yet, in a perversely human way, one can understand why Michael clung to it. Modern monarchy had not rewarded him very generously. It had given him a title, expectations, ceremonial belonging, and an address of great prestige, but never the clean purpose that might have disciplined his life. The older codes, blood, breeding, social ease, old-world diplomacy, private influence, suited him far better. They were the language in which he felt naturally fluent. The problem was that those same codes were becoming politically toxic, and he did not know how to live without them. So he kept moving through the same kinds of rooms. He kept accepting the same kinds of honors. He kept leaning on the same mix of status and personal charm. And all the while, each scandal around his wife made the public less willing to grant him the benefit of any doubt. His loyalty to her, admirable in one sense, became corrosive in another. It tied him permanently to every social blunder, every accusation of arrogance, every story that suggested the couple regarded ordinary standards as things that happened to other people. By then, even his better qualities had begun to read badly. His love of history looked like nostalgia for hierarchy. His foreign knowledge looked like a route into murky company. His princely charm looked like the sales technique of a man too practiced in being received. His independence from public funding, once used as a defense, now looked to some like the very reason his life had become so ethically blurry. He was earning, yes, but earning through a mystique produced by the institution whose cleaner boundaries he kept slipping past. This was the stage at which distrust became not just public but structural. Palace people may have disliked the noise of Princess Michael's scandals, but what truly worried institutions is pattern, and the pattern around Michael was, by now, impossible to miss. He floated near the edge of trouble, never quite sinking, never quite cleaning himself off either. He had foreign ties that looked awkward. He had private earning arrangements that depended on his public identity. He had a wife whose social instincts could wreck a room in seconds. He had a stubborn sense of rank that made retreat unlikely. And he had spent years convincing himself that this balancing act was sustainable because it had not yet ended in disaster. Men often mistake survival for vindication. That was Michael's error. Every embarrassment he endured without being cast out seemed to reassure him that the system would continue to absorb these shocks. But systems do not absorb shocks forever. They record them. They let them accumulate. They wait until one final incident makes all the previous ones feel like preparation. And by the end of the 2000s and 10s, that preparation was complete. Prince Michael of Kent no longer looked like a misunderstood minor royal trying to preserve dignity on the family margins. He looked like a warning about what happens when royalty is left half official and half commercial. A warning about the danger of believing personal charm can outpace public suspicion. A warning that old-world glamour, when mixed with modern money and weak judgment, does not become sophistication. It becomes risk. Soon the world would be allowed to watch exactly how that risk worked in practice, with cameras, false names, promises, and a price. with cameras, false names, promises, and a price. That was when the old suspicion around Prince Michael stopped feeling like gossip and started feeling like evidence. For years people had argued over him in that half-amused, half-irritated way reserved for troublesome lesser royals. Was he really doing anything so dreadful? Was he simply trying to earn a living while carrying an inconvenient title? Was he unfairly judged because his wife was so easy to dislike? Was it all just another case of the public resenting a prince for living like a prince? Those questions had protected him, at least a little. So long as the doubts remained abstract, Michael could keep floating in that familiar grey space where his life had always taken shape. Then the grey space was filmed. In 2021, undercover reporters posing as representatives of a fake South Korean company approached Prince Michael's circle, supposedly seeking help with business opportunities involving Russia. It was exactly the sort of setup that exposed the weak point in his entire life. Not because he was a fool, and not because he had no idea how such things worked. Quite the opposite. He had spent decades building himself into a man for whom this proposition would sound normal. A private arrangement, international business, quiet connections, usefulness rooted in prestige. He had trained himself to hear those words as opportunity rather than warning. The reporters did not need to tempt him with vulgarity. They tempted him with relevance. That is the detail that matters most. People sometimes imagine corruption as greed alone, but with men like Michael, the hunger is rarely that simple. Greed may be present, of course, but it is often braided with vanity, self-justification, and that soft, intoxicating belief that one is not merely profiting. One is helping, one is facilitating, one is bringing to bear a lifetime of cultivated connections that would be wasted if they were not put to use. Once a man starts thinking like that, almost any line can be crossed with excellent manners. The footage and reporting that emerged were ugly in exactly the way Michael had always seemed vulnerable to. Not theatrical ugliness, not drunken shouting or a mistress in pearls. Something colder, something more establishment. One of Michael's business associates spoke of access to the Russian president's inner circle. There was discussion of fees. Michael himself appeared willing to describe the sort of influence he could still quietly bring to bear. The image was not of a prince stumbling into disgrace by accident. It was of a prince who had made a profession out of living near the edge of impropriety, and had finally been caught speaking the language of that edge too plainly. And the language was revealing. He appeared to present himself as able to help discreetly. That word alone told the whole story. Discreetly, not publicly, not as part of some obvious royal or diplomatic channel, not under the bright lamp of duty, quietly, privately, in the old aristocratic style where what matters most is not what you officially are permitted to do, but what people believe you can arrange if the conversation is held in the right room, and the price is respectful enough not to sound crude. Michael had spent years building a life that depended on others believing in exactly that sort of quiet usefulness. Here at last it was laid bare. His defenders moved quickly, and one can understand why. They said no deal had been completed. They said he had not had the kind of active contact with the Russian leadership implied by the sting. They said he was being misrepresented, pushed by circumstances, drawn into a constructed situation. There was some truth in parts of that defense. Undercover operations are designed to entice and expose. They do not produce natural behavior in a vacuum. They are traps, carefully baited. But the moral force of a trap lies in what it reveals about the trapped. And what it revealed about Prince Michael was precisely what many had feared for years. He saw his title as a usable instrument, not merely a burden, not merely an inheritance, not merely a ceremonial oddity to be carried with stoic dignity. An instrument, something that could be converted in the right circumstances into introductions, status, commercial possibility, and money. The reason this struck people so hard was that it made sense of everything that had come before. Suddenly, the years of consultancy, the carefully maintained international friendships, the air of cultivated usefulness, the Russian passion, the resistance to surrendering royal style, the palace apartment rows, all of it lined up. It no longer looked like scattered episodes in the life of a misunderstood prince. It looked like one coherent pattern. He had spent decades monetizing the aura of proximity to power, while insisting that this was merely the practical reality of a prince who needed to earn. The public did not hear practicality, it heard sale. And that was ruinous, because sale is the one word monarchy cannot survive comfortably. Royal families sell fantasy all the time, of course. They sell continuity, ceremony, beauty, ancestry, romance, duty, all of it. But they must never look as if individual members are openly selling access to the machinery itself. Once that starts, the entire institution begins to resemble a private members' club with a hereditary crest above the door. Britain can tolerate a great deal from monarchy, but it does not like being reminded that the doors have prices. Michael's defenders also pointed out something that had been true for years. He was not a salaried senior royal living on an official public allowance while secretly doing side deals. He had always been in the uncomfortable outer zone, expected to live royally but find much of his own funding. That arrangement, they implied, had all but driven him toward these ambiguities. Again, there was truth in it. The monarchy had created a category of person almost designed to get into trouble, too grand to disappear, too underdefined to be safely contained, too recognizable to live like an ordinary businessman, too peripheral to be protected like a central royal. Michael had not invented that trap, but he had made himself at home in it. That was the difference. Some men who live inside a bad system show signs of hating it. Others show signs of trying to reform it. Michael too often looked like a man who had found the system inconvenient at first and then discovered it could be rather useful once one learned to work the hinges. The sting did not create that impression. It simply stripped away the silk covering from it. What made the moment particularly humiliating was how old-fashioned it all felt. Not in the noble sense, in the stale sense, the language of private introductions, the off-the-books usefulness, the flattering of wealthy foreigners, the implication that a prince, if handled properly, might open doors that official channels could not. It sounded less like modern public service than like the exhausted afterlife of empire, when men with titles drift through drawing rooms, turning ancient prestige into quiet advantage. That impression is deadly because it makes a royal seem not just untrustworthy, but obsolete. Michael had always hated the idea of being obsolete. One can feel it in the entire arc of his life. He was born too far from the throne to matter in the obvious way. He lost his father so early that identity itself became an inheritance problem. He built a military career, then a consultancy, then a niche around Russia, then a public role as a royal cousin with unusual foreign expertise. He kept finding ways to make himself useful because being merely decorative was intolerable to him. There is even something rather moving in that. A lesser man might have become lazy, petulant, or dull. Michael did none of those things. He sought relevance with determination. His tragedy was that he pursued relevance through the one channel guaranteed to erode trust, private influence. And because he pursued it with such princely calm, the effect was worse. If he had looked desperate, people might have pitied him. If he had looked crude, they might have dismissed him as ridiculous. Instead he looked practiced, comfortable, a man not improvising in disgrace, but drawing on habits long established. It did not help that the timing was politically poisonous. Britain by then was already deeply uneasy about Russian money, Russian influence, and the long years in which wealthy Russians had been welcomed into elite London life with more appetite than caution. What once looked glamorous now looked compromised. What once sounded cosmopolitan now sounded gullible, or worse. Prince Michael's long romance with Russia, which had once lent him mystery and distinction, now came back to haunt him with almost perfect cruelty. For decades he had treated Russia as the place where his bloodline, intellect, and usefulness converged. Now the country had become a test of judgment, and his judgment looked appalling. This is where the older emotional story returns with force. Michael loved the Russian connection because it gave him a form of meaning his British life never fully offered. In Russia he was not just another Windsor cousin at the edge of the frame. He was a man with Romanov blood, a prince who spoke the language, an aristocratic survivor of the family web that revolution had tried to tear apart. Russia let him feel historical. It let him feel necessary. It let him inhabit a larger drama than the constrained, often faintly mocking one available to him at home. That emotional need does not excuse anything, but it explains why he remained vulnerable long after a more cautious man would have backed away. To Michael, Russia was never simply a market or a diplomatic interest. It was a mirror in which he looked grander, sadder, and more significant than he could ever look in Britain. Men rarely surrender. The mirror that flatters their deepest wound. The sting shattered that flattering image in public. Suddenly, his Russian passion no longer looked noble or romantic. It looked transactional. It looked like the ideal cover story for a prince who had spent too many years persuading himself that family history and private influence were part of the same elegant package. What followed was not exile in the dramatic old royal sense. The House of Windsor no longer stages its punishments with thunderbolts unless absolutely necessary. It prefers dimming lamps, quiet removal, fewer invitations, fewer functions, less visible usefulness. The institution had already learned through other more catastrophic family scandals that public fury can be met most effectively not with operatic banishment, but with administrative cooling. People are not thrown from towers now. They are gently left off the list. Michael was already old enough that this dimming could be presented as natural. Age, fewer engagements, a smaller public role, a quieter life. But everyone understood the deeper point. Trust, never abundant where he was concerned, had drained almost entirely away. And inside the family, that matters more than public gossip. Royal families are not warm meritocracies. They are survival machines, disguised as bloodlines. The question beneath every arrangement is always the same. Can this person be relied upon not to endanger the larger organism? Can he keep his head? Can he keep his mouth closed? Can he refuse the wrong sort of invitation? Can he understand that some opportunities are traps because they appeal too perfectly to his own vanity? By that standard, Prince Michael had failed. Not in one explosive instant, perhaps, but in the cumulative way that troubles institutions most. He had shown that he could be drawn into exactly the kind of conversation that respectable modern monarchy needs its members to avoid without hesitation. No matter how he explained it afterward, the footage suggested that the old instincts remained alive. The instincts toward discretion, private channels, monetized status, foreign access, and the ever-seductive idea that a prince on the margins can still matter immensely if he is willing to operate just outside the bright circle. That is why the sting cut so much deeper than the old rows about rent or the social offences of his wife. Those had made him look arrogant, careless, and entitled. This made him look available. A royal who looks available is a very dangerous thing. Available to money. Available to vanity. available to foreign interests. Available to anyone who knows how to package flattery as opportunity. The monarchy can survive boorishness more easily than availability. Bores embarrass, available men compromise. Of course, Michael was not the only royal to generate that sort of anxiety. By the early 21st century, the family had other members causing more lurid forms of alarm. That comparison, however, did him no favours. If anything, it made him look like a more elegant version of the same disease. Not the crashing, sweating, catastrophic style of scandal, but the tailored one. The version that keeps a straight back, chooses excellent cufflinks, and speaks of informal channels as though discussing the weather. Sometimes that sort is more dangerous because people mistake polish for principle. There was also an irony so sharp it nearly seemed written by a novelist. Changes in succession law had eventually restored Michael's place in the line after the old rule penalizing marriage to a Roman Catholic was removed. It was a modern correction, one that quietly undid the constitutional cost of his marriage. Yet by the time the law had become kinder, his reputation had become far worse. He regained a technical place in the order of inheritance at the very moment the public had ceased to trust his judgment in almost any sphere that mattered. It was the perfect Windsor contradiction: progress in theory, unease in practice. His wife, naturally, remained part of the problem. Even when Michael himself took centre stage in scandal, Marie Christine hovered just behind the curtain as the woman who had for years trained the public to view the household through a lens of contempt. Her own controversies had made it easier for people to believe the worst about him. Once a couple becomes fixed in the national imagination as grand, difficult, and too pleased with itself, every later disgrace arrives pre-interpreted. Viewers do not watch with open minds, they watch for confirmation. And confirmation was exactly what the sting supplied. Still, one should resist making Michael into a cartoon villain. He was not. He was something much more familiar and therefore more interesting. A man formed by privilege, injury, longing, and old-world codes, trying to preserve significance in a world that no longer allowed significance to be worn so loosely. He had talent, he had intelligence, he had social gifts of a very high order. He might, under stricter discipline or clearer purpose, have become genuinely useful in ways that inspired confidence. Instead, he spent too many years in the half-light, persuading himself that because he was neither central nor publicly funded in the obvious way, he could improvise a version of royal life for himself. Improvisation is dangerous in monarchies. It leaves fingerprints everywhere. By the time the reporters were done with him, Michael no longer looked like a prince burdened by ambiguity. He looked like a prince who had learned to exploit ambiguity so well that he had forgotten other people could see it too. And just when he most needed the old defence that his Russian interests were cultural, historical, and above politics, history itself turned against him. The continent darkened. Tanks, sanctions, frozen fortunes, broken illusions. All those years in which Russia had given him glamour and purpose were about to become a liability, so severe that even the most polished explanations would start to sound like relics from a foolish age. Relics from a foolish age. That was exactly how the old Russian enchantment began to look once the enchantment was over. For years, wealthy Russians in London had been treated as though they were some glittering new ingredient in the social sauce. Difficult to place, perhaps, occasionally vulgar, often mysterious, but undeniably rich and undeniably useful to people who liked living well. There had been dinners, charities, business forums, polite speeches about friendship between nations, and the sort of smiling photographs that later make everyone insist they were only being diplomatic. Prince Michael had moved through that world with particular ease because he had spent much of his life preparing to move through it. He could talk about history, bloodlines, culture, empire, and memory in a way that made hard money look dressed for the opera. Then war made all that dressing look tawdry. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the atmosphere changed with breathtaking speed. The old excuses shrank overnight. Whatever had once been sold as cosmopolitan, nuanced, historically informed, or commercially sensible was suddenly measured against cities under bombardment and families fleeing west with their lives packed into plastic bags. That moral shock mattered enormously. It did not merely alter policy, it altered tone. Things that had once seemed merely questionable now looked sordid. Things that had once sounded sophisticated now sounded weak, vain, or compromised. For Prince Michael, whose long public identity had been tangled up with Russian links, Russian sentiment, Russian circles, and Russian usefulness, it was disastrous. He was not accused of planning invasions or directing policy. That was never the point. The point was judgment. And judgment is where trust either lives or dies. In the years before the invasion, Michael had been able to present his Russian relationship as something richer than money and broader than politics. It came from family history, from the Romanov bloodline that so fascinated him, from language, from cultural ties, from decades of interest. He could claim, and perhaps genuinely believe, that he represented a more humane bridge between Britain and Russia than the crude business opportunists who merely sniffed profit. He was not just another man chasing contracts, he was a prince carrying memory. That was the story he told himself, and for a long time enough, other people were willing to let him tell it. After the tanks rolled, that story began to collapse. Because in harsh times, people stop admiring romantic ambiguity. They start asking simpler questions. Who did you stand beside? Whose company did you enjoy? What did you allow yourself to believe because belief was flattering? And perhaps most painfully of all, what did you refuse to see because seeing clearly would have deprived you of the role you enjoyed playing? For Michael, that role had been one of the great emotional prizes of his adult life. Russia allowed him to feel larger than the British monarchy had ever quite let him feel. In Britain, he was peripheral, elegant, useful now and then, but never central. In relation to Russia, he could feel singular. He had lineage there, he had language there, he had a kind of ghostly legitimacy there. He could imagine himself not as a cousin on the margin, but as a living thread joining imperial tragedy, modern diplomacy, and private influence. Men do not surrender a role like that easily, especially if it has healed some old wound in them. And Michael had old wounds enough. One must keep returning to that point because otherwise he becomes too flat, too easy. A handsome royal operator, a vain princely fixer, a man who sold his aura and got caught. All of that captures part of the truth, but not the whole of it. He was also the posthumous son of a glamorous father he never knew, the younger brother who inherited no defining title, the royal child who watched history from the corner rather than the throne. That kind of life creates a permanent ache for distinction. Michael did not simply want comfort, he wanted significance. He wanted the world to make room for him in a way that felt earned, chosen, and vivid. Russia gave him that illusion for years. The invasion destroyed it. In practical terms, the old associations became impossible to defend in the same way. Patronages and business-linked honours that had once sounded grand now sounded embarrassing. Public life after the invasion did not reward sentimental speeches about mutual understanding. It rewarded distance, clarity, renunciation. Everyone with respectable standing began looking for ways to prove they had not been naively bewitched by Russian money or proximity. Some people did this quickly and loudly, others did it quietly and late. Michael did not seem, in the public imagination at least, like a man who had seen the danger early. He looked like a man who had lived too long inside. The danger to notice its smell. That is a devastating thing for a prince, because princes are meant to possess instinct. Not genius, not sainthood, instinct. The ability to sense the wrong room, the wrong friend, the wrong transaction, the wrong photograph, the wrong invitation. A royal may not always be morally superior, but he is expected to understand what sort of appearances the institution can survive. Michael again and again proved that he did not understand this nearly well enough, or worse, that he understood it but believed he could manage the risk because his own motives were decent enough in his own eyes. That belief looked especially pitiful after 2022. Suddenly, the long decades of Anglo-Russian networking in grand rooms appeared less like diplomacy and more like a collective failure of vanity. The British establishment in politics, finance, law, aristocratic society, and even parts of the cultural world had spent years enjoying the company of people it later preferred to describe as complicated. Michael was hardly alone in that, but he was unique in one respect. He brought the glamour of monarchy to the table. He did not merely attend, he blessed. He lent it a little royal fragrance, a little old-world lace over modern money. That was precisely why the whole thing looked so much worse once the light changed. His defenders might say, with some justice, that he had always been sincere in his interest, that his Russian connection was never wholly commercial, that he had spoken the language, studied the history, and engaged with the country long before it became fashionable for London hostesses to fuss over oligarch guests. All true, at least in part, but sincerity is not the same as wisdom. Some of the most dangerous public mistakes are made by men who are entirely sincere in their own importance. The monarchy by this point was in no mood to indulge such mistakes. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022 changed the emotional architecture of the family in ways that went beyond mourning. She had been the great absorber of discomfort, not always kindly, not always warmly, but steadily. Under her reign, awkward relatives could remain awkward for astonishing lengths of time, so long as they did not detonate in a way that directly threatened the institution. The Queen had a genius for endurance. She also had a deeply ingrained loyalty to family structures, however exasperating. A cousin like Michael, troublesome, polished, never quite straightforward, could survive for years in that world because she understood how to carry human inconvenience the way she carried handbags, firmly and without visible fuss. Her son was different. Charles III had spent a lifetime thinking about monarchy as something that needed shaping, slimming, modernizing, and morally clarifying, at least in public appearance. He might be sentimental in some private respects, but institutionally he had much less appetite for ornamental ambiguity. The family had already endured too much bruising from figures who blurred the line between rank and personal grievance, rank and commerce, rank and self-drama. Charles inherited not the calm deference of the 1950s, but a monarchy battered by scandal, tabloid warfare, generational conflict, and endless public arguments over relevance, money, and duty. In such a climate, a prince like Michael was not charmingly old-fashioned. He was administrative clutter with reputational risk attached. That sounds cruel, but cruelty is often the language of institutional survival. Michael's problem was not merely that he had become embarrassing, it was that he embodied a whole style of royal life the new age wanted to push further into the shadows, not the noble old style of sacrifice and stiff upper lip, the other one, the style in which titled people drift through private networks, leaning on inherited prestige to lubricate commerce, cultivating foreign relationships whose moral content is always one step behind their glamour, and treating public criticism as a vulgar misunderstanding of aristocratic nuance. Charles could not publicly preach a leaner, cleaner monarchy, while allowing that style to remain brightly lit. So Michael receded. This retreat was not dramatic in the old theatrical sense. No public stripping of rank, no balcony denunciation, no grand statement about betrayal. Royal family punishment, when it wishes to look civilized, prefers absence. The invitations become fewer. The visible duties thin. The household machinery no longer bends itself around your convenience. You are not exactly disowned because monarchy hates waste and public bloodshed. You are simply rendered less relevant in plain sight. For a man like Michael, that may have been harder than outright banishment. Banishment at least carries a kind of tragic glamour. Receding carries none. It is a slow instruction from history that your services are no longer needed, or rather that your services have become more dangerous than your disappearance. Michael had spent a lifetime resisting that message. Everything he built, the military career, the consultancy, the Russian role, the cultivated foreign contacts, the princely presentation, all of it had been a rebellion against irrelevance. Now old age and public disgust combined to impose irrelevance on him anyway. And his wife was still there, still impossible to separate from the overall impression. By this stage, Princess Michael of Kent had become something almost mythic in public culture. Not beloved myth, but cautionary myth. The grand, difficult, tone-deaf princess with the brooch, the remarks, the strange defences, the cool hauteur, the ever-present sense that she belonged more naturally to a vanished Europe of rank than to any modern national life. There are some women who become easier with age because the edges soften and the world grows tired of fighting them. She was not one of them. Even when she apologized, the apology seemed attached to the same old consciousness of self. She could sound sorry for the inconvenience while never entirely surrendering the conviction that the real problem was everyone else's inability to appreciate context. Living beside such a woman for decades required either passivity or complicity. Michael was too intelligent for passivity, which left complicity, though perhaps of a deeply marital and emotionally complicated kind. He may have loved her exactly because she reflected something he admired and needed, a refusal to bow too completely, a conviction that rank still meant something, in a flattened age, a kind of beautiful resistance to ordinariness. But a husband's private admiration can become a prince's public liability. Every fresh scandal around her had trained people to see their household as one unit of judgment. By the time Michael's own dealings came under sharper scrutiny, the national imagination was already primed to believe the least generous interpretation. The war in Ukraine sharpened that old contempt into something colder than gossip. Now, it was not simply that Michael seemed grand and slippery. He seemed like a relic of the very establishment failure Britain was trying to deny, the years of shrugging at dubious wealth, flattering oneself that social polish meant political harmlessness and mistaking access for wisdom. People no longer looked at him and saw a misunderstood minor royal. They saw the sort of man who could spend decades telling himself he was building bridges while never noticing what was crossing them in the other direction. That realization changed even the emotional meaning of his earlier life. The dead father, once a romantic source of sympathy, now seemed almost too neat, like the opening chapter of a story whose later turns had lost their innocence. The military career, once proof of structure and service, no longer protected him from the charge that he had traded too happily on the princely residue afterward. The Russian scholarship and linguistic seriousness, once genuinely impressive, now appeared to have equipped him for a compromising intimacy he had not handled wisely. The private earning, once defended as practical necessity for a lesser royal, now looked less like honest adaptation and more like the beginning of a long education in how to use inherited mystique without ever quite admitting that was what he was doing. This is how trust truly vanishes, not through the discovery of one monstrous act, but through reinterpretation. People go back over the whole life and suddenly all the old scenes look different. The palace apartment is no longer just a row about rent. It is evidence of a man unwilling to live by ordinary limits. The consultancy is no longer just work. It is evidence of a prince comfortable selling rare access. The Russian ties are no longer just family sentiment. They are evidence of a weakness for being made to feel important by powerful outsiders. The wife's social scandals are no longer just embarrassing outbursts. They are evidence of a household insulated from the moral weather of the world. When that reinterpretation takes hold, recovery becomes almost impossible. And yet the strange thing about Prince Michael is that one can still glimpse the lonely, human core of him, even at this stage, an old man now moving through ceremonies as a reminder of some older arrangement, still carrying himself beautifully, still possessed of that polished princely face, though age had softened and thinned it. One can imagine him looking around at modern Britain, at the shrill transparency of the age, at the endless suspicion, the flattening of rank, the moral certainties, the cruel instant judgment of public life, and feeling not only embarrassed but exiled from his own manners. He was a creature of nuance as he understood it, of whispers, allusion, lineage, memory, private channels, long lunches and civilized ambiguity. Modern public life had declared war on ambiguity, at least selectively. It was never going to be his natural habitat. But the monarchy does not exist to protect a man's natural habitat. It exists to survive public judgment. That is why Michael became so useful as a warning within the wider royal story. Not because he was the most shocking sinner in the family. He was not. Others drew greater outrage, greater disgust, greater tabloid frenzy. But Michael represented a quieter danger, the danger of a royal who appears endlessly negotiable. Not sexually reckless in the most obvious way, not politically loud, not emotionally volcanic, but negotiable, available, adaptable to private advantage, soft around the edges where principle should harden. Institutionally, that can be worse than flamboyant scandal because it is harder to fence off. Flamboyant scandal can be condemned. Negotiability seeps. It moves through business, foreign relationships, hospitality, favours, patronage, and every soft network where monarchy most wants to appear ceremonial and least wants to appear purchasable. And Michael, for all his personal elegance, had come to embody exactly that fear. By the middle of the decade, his life looked less like a successful act of adaptation and more like the long aftermath of a constitutional mistake. The monarchy had allowed a category of prince to exist who was too royal to work like an ordinary man and too underdefined to live safely as a symbolic figure alone. Michael had responded to that mistake with intelligence, vanity, and an appetite for significance. Those qualities carried him for years. In the end, they left him exposed. There was still family life, of course, birthdays, private griefs, church services, marriages, funerals, the small and large sorrows that continue even when public standing collapses. No royal, however distrusted, ever ceases to be human in those rooms. Michael remained a father, a grandfather, a husband, a brother. He still belonged by blood even when trust had worn away. Sometimes that is the cruelest form of belonging, to be admitted by birth while no longer believed in by instinct. And the family itself was heading into a stretch of grief and strain that would expose all of its members in one way or another. The old Queen was gone. Charles was trying to steady a changed monarchy. Harry and Meghan had blown open one sort of wound, Andrew had become another, and the outer branches of the family were being viewed with less romance and more blunt curiosity than ever before. It was a terrible moment to be a prince whose entire adult life invited questions about judgment. Michael had spent decades trying to prove that he was more than an afterthought. In the end, the proof curdled. He mattered, certainly, but he mattered as an example of how royal status, if left too long in the hands of a man hungry for meaning and too comfortable with private influence, can decay from privilege into suspicion without ever quite passing through outright disgrace. And then sorrow came even closer, not as gossip, not as a sting, not as another row about status or friends or money, but as the kind of intimate family blow that strips all performance away and leaves only blood, age, and grief. And then sorrow came even closer, not as gossip, not as a sting, not as another row about status or friends or money, but as the kind of intimate family blow that strips all performance away and leaves only blood, age, and grief. In February of 2024, Thomas Kingston, the husband of Lady Gabriella Kingston, Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's daughter, died suddenly. He was a handsome, well-connected man, educated, polished, exactly the sort of figure who moved easily through that upper layer of British life, where money, old families, and royal cousins tend to overlap without ever fully admitting how close they are. His death was a terrible shock. No amount of social ease prepares a family for the brutality of sudden loss. One day there is the ordinary drift of calls, plans, invitations, half-finished domestic routines, and the next there is a silence so large it seems to swallow the walls. For Michael, that loss must have rung with a very old echo, because grief in families like this is never neatly confined to the present. It knocks against earlier griefs and wakes them. The dead gather around one another in memory. A son who never knew his father properly can become, in old age, a man standing yet again in the company of sudden death, yet again facing a younger generation wounded by something irrevocable and absurdly final. Whatever else Prince Michael had become in public, whatever suspicions clung to him, whatever scepticism the nation felt about his judgment, he was still a father watching his daughter endure one of the great brutalities of human life. In that moment, there is no useful title, no polished explanation, no discreet arrangement, no private channel that can soften what has happened. The public saw him at the memorial service, older now, slowed, visibly marked by years, and suddenly the great machine of opinion did what it sometimes does in the face of private bereavement. It paused, not forever, not generously enough to erase the past, but for a moment the story ceased to be about an untrustworthy prince and became about an elderly father entering church under the weight of another family tragedy. That is one of the strange things about royalty. People can despise the institution, resent the privilege, mock the absurdity, and still be moved by the simple sight of age meeting sorrow in public. Yet even here the Michael story remained complicated, because grief can soften a face without repairing a reputation. The sadness was real, the family wound was real, but the years that had come before did not disappear simply because death had imposed better manners on the public. If anything, the contrast made the whole portrait sharper. There he was, a man genuinely deserving sympathy in one part of his life and deeply mistrusted in another. It is tempting to imagine that private suffering washes out public doubt, but it rarely does. Human beings are not neat enough for that. A man may be loving and compromised, loyal and vain, grief-stricken and poorly judged, all in the same body. Michael had always been that kind of mixture. It is part of what made him difficult to dismiss entirely. Had he been only ridiculous, he would have become a joke. Had he been only corrupt, he would have become a villain. Had he been only melancholy and misplaced, he might have become a tragic figure. But Prince Michael never offered the comfort of a single, clean category. Even his faults had a peculiar elegance to them, and even his better impulses were often entangled with self-regard. That was true in grief as much as in everything else. The family around him had, by this point, changed almost beyond recognition from the world into which he was born. The Queen, who had always functioned as the great fixed axis around which all the inconvenient relatives still managed to orbit, was gone. Charles was on the throne trying to maintain dignity, modernity, economy, and continuity all at once, which is a bit like trying to keep a souffle upright in a thunderstorm. William and Catherine represented the safer future, calm on the surface, disciplined in tone, careful with the symbols. Harry and Meghan had become the family's most public rupture, taking the language of grievance and race and emotional injury out into the world with a force the institution had not been able to contain. Andrew had already sunk into the kind of disgrace that makes every other scandal look almost decorous by comparison. And then, drifting at the edge of all that central turmoil, stood Prince Michael of Kent, one of the oldest living reminders of a different royal problem. Not lust run wild, not direct constitutional crisis, not tabloid melodrama at full volume, something more lingering than that. The problem of what happens when a prince is allowed to remain half inside the institution and half in the marketplace for so long that nobody can quite remember where the ceremonial ends and the selling begins. By old age, people often reveal what they have really been all along. They may speak less, travel less, dazzle less, but the inner shape becomes clearer. In Michael's case, age stripped him down to essentials. The handsome younger man who had once looked like a royal matinee idol had become an elderly figure of fading glamour. But the structure beneath remained the same. He still held himself like a prince. He still moved with that controlled old school bearing that says training, rank, and self-consciousness all at once. He still seemed somehow to inhabit the title rather than merely possess it. That, in a way, was always the issue. Michael did not treat princeliness as an abstract accident of birth. He lived it. He wore it. He expected life to arrange itself around it to at least some degree. That sounds obvious until one remembers that not every royal relation behaves that way. Some shrink into private life. Some lean hard into service. Some become bores, which is often the safest path of all. Michael chose something else. He insisted over and over on preserving the texture of royalty in his life, the scale, the presentation, the access, the surroundings, the foreign friendships, the sense that he remained a man of consequence, even if the Constitution did not assign him a central consequence to hold. That insistence made him interesting. It also made him dangerous. Because once a man becomes determined to preserve consequence, he starts looking for ways to prove it. He cannot merely be a genial old cousin at church services and funerals. He cannot simply fade into the outer greenery of the family. He needs arenas in which he still feels useful, still feels singular, still feels like someone whose call matters. That was the trap Michael never quite escaped. He kept seeking proof that his princely identity still had weight in the world, and the very search for that proof kept leading him into situations that confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. It is worth lingering on this because people often misread the source of royal trouble. They imagine greed as the central motive, and sometimes it is. But greed alone does not explain Michael. He had expensive tastes, certainly. He liked beautiful settings, important company, grand old assumptions. He was not a monk in cavalry breeches, yet simple greed would have produced a cruder man. Michael's true weakness was that he wanted his life to feel proportionate to his birth. He wanted the world to reflect back to him the significance that the line of succession had denied. Money helped with that. Foreign honours helped. Important contacts helped. Social standing helped. but beneath all of it was the more emotional need to matter in a princely way. That is why he was so available to the wrong kinds of attention. Not because he lacked intelligence, he had plenty. Not because he lacked breeding, he had that in dangerous abundance, but because he lacked the sort of inner discipline that allows a person to accept a smaller place without constantly trying to enlarge it by private means. The public, of course, does not usually phrase things so gently. The public sniffs out something simpler. He seems slippery. He seems too interested in the value of being Prince Michael rather than simply being Michael Windsor, with a title attached. He seems forever at ease with people who have reason to enjoy his company. He seems like a man who would tell himself a flattering story about almost any arrangement if the arrangement preserved his style of life and his sense of relevance. And because people sensed that, they never quite trusted his motives, even when his actions were not in themselves monstrous. That distinction matters especially now because by the time one reaches the late chapters of a life, there is a temptation to flatten everything into either pity or condemnation. Pity says he was only a minor royal, badly placed, trying to cope with a role that was never properly designed. Condemnation says he was a calculating princely hustler who wrapped privilege in manners and sold it to the highest bidder. Both contain truth. Neither is sufficient on its own. He was produced by a very particular royal ecology. He was born into a generation raised in the long shadow of empire, war, and inherited European grandeur. He belonged to a family that had been taught, from nursery onward, that rank was not simply social for a decoration, but a structure of reality. Then he lived long enough to watch Britain become a country increasingly suspicious of inherited grandeur, increasingly fixated on fairness, increasingly impatient with deference, and increasingly alert to the ways money can hide inside prestige. In that changed world, Michael kept trying to live by older instincts. Of course, he made himself suspect. He had been shaped to. That does not absolve him. It simply makes him more revealing. His wife remained equally revealing in another register. Princess Michael of Kent had by now become almost an emblem of the social habits that modern Britain most dislikes, to in aristocratic women, the hauteur, the strange racial insensitivities, the inability to understand when a joke is not a joke because history is sitting in the room, the feeling that personal confidence can survive any amount of public disgust. She had spent years making herself not just unpopular, but symbolically useful to anyone who wanted proof that parts of the royal world still remained trapped in a museum of old assumptions. Michael's loyalty to her, whatever private strains or exasperations it may have included, was one of the few uncomplicatedly consistent things about him. He never threw her overboard to save himself. He never performed the useful, husbandly ritual of public distance for the sake of reputation. He stood beside her. That may be admirable in marriage. In public life it bound his image to hers so completely that by the end of their long story, many people could not think of one without summoning the atmosphere of the other. And atmosphere was always crucial where Michael was concerned. There are some people who lose trust because of one devastating revelation. Michael lost trust by atmosphere first and revelation second. Long before the undercover sting, long before the later disgust about Russian circles, many had already decided that there was something in his life that did not smell right. The apartment rose, the consultancy, the social world, the wife, the endless proximity to wealth, the careful insistence that everything was proper. It all created a background hum of unease. So when the sharper evidence arrived, it did not so much change public opinion as complete it. That is why the final years of his story carry such a curious sadness. Not because the man was destroyed in some operatic sense, but because the nature of his defeat was so perfectly fitted to his character. He had spent decades trying to avoid becoming a royal irrelevance. In the end, irrelevance was imposed on him not by obscurity, but by distrust. He mattered just enough and in the wrong way, enough to alarm, enough to embarrass, enough to serve as an institutional lesson. One can imagine how galling that would be to a man of his temperament. He would have preferred to be remembered, if remembered at all, as the polished cousin, the veteran, the linguist, the historian, the Romanov link, the cultivated European prince who gave useful service and kept a grand old tone alive in a flattening age. Instead, the memory that settled around him was harsher. He became the royal nobody trusted, not necessarily the worst, not the loudest scandal, not the most obscene disgrace, but the one who seemed to illustrate a subtler rot, the rot of unofficial influence, the rot of monetized aura, the rot of a prince whose whole life kept asking other people to believe that appearance and interest had not become entangled. And perhaps that label cut so deep because it struck at the exact thing he had spent his life performing. Trustworthiness is, after all, the invisible fabric of princely behavior, the handshake, the smile, the discretion, the honorific calm, the impression that a man inhabits his rank without exploiting it. That is the promise beneath the pageantry. Michael looked like that promise. He sounded like it. He dressed like it. He had the face for it. Which is precisely why the doubt around him felt so corrosive. He was not distrusted in spite of being princely. He was distrusted because he used princeliness in ways that made people wonder what the performance had been hiding all along. That is a very modern kind of royal failure. In older times, a troublesome prince might be violent, adulterous, politically rebellious, or ruinously extravagant. In modern constitutional monarchy, the more dangerous prince is often the one who smiles beautifully and turns status into a private currency. Michael belonged to that category. He turned up in the age of soft power, corporate networking, international forums, discreet consulting, and the belief that social distinction itself can be a monetizable asset. He did not invent that world, but he floated through it with an ease that made the monarchy look porous. And porosity is terrifying to old institutions. If one prince can become that negotiable, what exactly remains sacred? What exactly cannot be bought, borrowed, hinted at, or quietly brokered over lunch? Buckingham Palace will forgive all sorts of private foolishness more readily than it will forgive the suggestion that royal value is up for private negotiation. That is why Michael came to seem so alarming to those who cared about the institution's long-term dignity. He looked like a man who had, over time, ceased to feel the line. Yet even now, with his public standing diminished and his family touched again by grief, he could still produce the old optical illusion. A church service, a memorial, an old prince in dark coat and measured step. The cameras catch him in profile, and for a second, the whole complicated story disappears behind the picture. That, too, was one of his lifelong gifts. He could still look right. The trouble was that by then nobody believed the picture on its own fine anymore, and there is something almost unbearably British about that. A country that taught itself to read class through posture and vowels had become a country suspicious of posture and vowels precisely because they had so often concealed advantage. Michael had been educated into one moral theatre and judged by another. He never managed the transition. He kept acting in the old play while the audience had already moved to a new one and started booing. Still, the boos are not the whole ending, not yet. Because in families, even royal ones, distrust does not erase attachment. Michael remained part of the living chain, present at rites of passage, lodged in memory, still carrying with him all the old family lines, the Greek mother, the dead father, the Romanov ancestors, the childhood proximity to a queen, the vanished world of post-war royal cousins, growing up in houses full of duty and silence and old expectations. He was not cast out into some melodramatic wilderness. He remained where inconvenient family members so often remain, inside the circle but nearer its edge, present enough to remind everyone of what has happened, not trusted enough to be given more room than necessary. That is a lonely kind of survival. And loneliness, I suspect, had been with him all his life, not theatrical loneliness, with slammed doors and dramatic speeches, something colder and more aristocratic than that. The loneliness of being visible but secondary. The loneliness of carrying a grand name without a grand function. The loneliness of understanding too well how much doors open for you and still feeling, privately, that the most important doors never truly did. Michael spent years trying to cure that loneliness with significance, and significance kept leading him into the arms of suspicion. By the time grief returned to his family, that pattern was set too deeply to undo. He could still mourn sincerely. He could still love sincerely. He could still look every inch. The prince, at moments when decency required nothing more than solemn attendance. But the larger question his life had posed remained unanswered in any comfortable way. What is a prince for when he is not quite meant for service, not quite funded for splendour, and not quite humble enough to disappear? Michael had given one answer after another to that question, and nearly all of them had made people nervous. Now only one chapter remained, the cruelest one perhaps because it deals not with youth, ambition, opportunity, or even scandal, but with inheritance of a different kind, not the inheritance of titles and blood, but of judgment. What, after all, was Prince Michael really leaving behind? Not to the throne, not to history books, but to the public imagination that had watched him for decades and, in the end, decided that elegance could be every bit as dangerous as disgrace. Elegance could be every bit as dangerous as disgrace. That was the inheritance Prince Michael of Kent left behind, whether he would have liked the phrasing or not. He was not remembered as the great sinner of the family. He was not the one who shattered the institution in a single blast, nor the one whose name became shorthand for one lurid catastrophe. His story was more unnerving than that. He became memorable because he showed how a prince could look perfect on the surface and still leave people with the unmistakable feeling that something beneath the polish was always being quietly traded. And that feeling, once formed, is almost impossible to erase. By the final stretch of his public life, the case against him no longer depended on any single event. It was larger and more lingering than a scandal sheet. It was the accumulation of years in which he seemed to confirm the same fear from different angles, the fear that he was not simply living with royal ambiguity, but using it. The fear that he had found in his strange position royal enough to matter, not central enough to be tightly governed, a way of turning uncertainty into opportunity. The fear that behind the old world manners and the handsome military bearing there was a private logic forever at work, measuring what his title could still yield. That is why the phrase "nobody trusted him" rings so harshly and so accurately. It does not mean everyone thought him a criminal. It does not even mean he was hated in the hot emotional way some royals are hated. It means something colder. It means people felt they could never quite relax around his motives. They could never fully believe that his interests were only his stated interests. There always seemed to be another layer beneath the conversation, another advantage tucked behind the smile, another reason he might be in the room beyond the innocent one. In ordinary life, that kind of distrust is unpleasant. In royal life, it is fatal, because monarchy depends on a strange kind of faith, not deep democratic faith, not the faith one places in a leader chosen for skill or policy. Something softer and more symbolic. The faith that the people born closest to the pageant will at least protect the pageant from becoming too obviously transactional. The public can tolerate enormous privilege if it appears wrapped in restraint. It can tolerate inherited splendor if it comes with visible limits. What it cannot comfortably tolerate is the suspicion that a prince knows the exact market value of his own mystique. Michael looked like a man who knew. And perhaps the bitterest thing is that he probably knew because he had to know. His position had forced him into that calculation long before the public ever began resenting him for it. He was not born on the main royal road. He was born in one of the side lanes, beautiful enough to be noticed, high-born enough to be treated differently from other men, but not central enough to be given the clear machinery that would have disciplined his life. He was not the heir. He was not the principal spare. He was not the child of the sovereign. He was one of those dangerous royal figures created by the system almost accidentally, decorated by birth, constrained by protocol, and left to improvise. Improvisation was his making and his undoing. Had he been a different sort of man, that improvisation might have produced an entirely different legacy. A quieter man might have withdrawn into private life with grace. A more dutiful man might have built a life of narrow but reliable service. A less romantic man might have accepted the smallness of his constitutional role and found satisfaction elsewhere. Michael did none of these things. He refused to vanish, and he refused to look reduced. He refused, really, to accept that a prince with his breeding, face, intelligence, and lineage should simply become decorative background. That refusal was understandable. It was even, in its way, admirable. But admirable motives do not guarantee admirable outcomes. Sometimes they create the most dangerous outcomes of all, because the person involved feels too justified to hear the warning bells. Michael always seemed to understand himself as a man unfairly stuck in an awkward category, and because he understood himself that way, he could present his own arrangements as necessity rather than appetite. Of course he needed to work. Of course he needed a proper setting. Of course his foreign connections made sense. Of course his historical knowledge was genuine. Of course his title opened doors. It would have been almost childish from his point of view to pretend otherwise. Yet monarchy needs exactly that childishness. It needs its princes to act as if the doors opening are somehow secondary to the conduct they bring through them. Michael too often seemed aware of the doors first. There was also the problem of beauty, and this should not be underestimated. Beautiful men in royal families often survive longer than they should. They are granted more elegance in memory, more softness in judgment, because their very appearance seems to carry a promise. Michael had that sort of face for many years, smooth, aristocratic, composed, with enough of the old Kent glamour to remind people of the father whose legend hovered over him like expensive cologne. He looked as though he ought to be trustworthy. He looked like one of those mid-century princes who emerge from cars in dark coats and somehow make every doorway seem more serious. That appearance was not trivial. It protected him. It allowed him to seem like substance when sometimes what he really offered was style, atmosphere, and cultivated access. And because he looked the part so perfectly, the eventual distrust around him cut even deeper. A clownish royal can be dismissed, a shabby one can be mocked, a coarse one can be denounced. But a man who looks princely in the old true sense and still leaves people doubting him produces a very particular disappointment. He seems like a betrayal of the costume itself. His wife sharpened that disappointment in another way. Princess Michael of Kent embodied the aspects of old aristocratic womanhood that modern public life distrusts most fiercely. The hauteur, the casual offensiveness, the inability to register that history has changed the emotional meaning of certain symbols, the assumption that self-confidence can outrun consequences. All of it made her a walking argument against nostalgia. She did not merely embarrass her husband, She stripped away his defences. Every time she caused outrage, she made it harder for anyone to believe that their household was guided by sound instinct. Every social blunder, every racial offence, every imperious moment suggested that the atmosphere around Michael was not accidentally misjudged. It was structurally insulated. He chose that atmosphere. He lived in it. He defended it by continuing to inhabit it. That matters because too much sympathy can blur his agency. Yes, he was shaped by the oddness of his royal position. Yes, he was denied a straightforward role. Yes, the institution created a dangerous category of half-official prince. But many people are badly placed by systems without turning those placements into lifelong studies in negotiable prestige. Michael did. He built a life around the very ambiguities that should have frightened him. He seemed to believe he could balance forever on the line between ceremonial value and private advantage because he had been balancing there for so long already. That confidence was fatal to his reputation. What makes the story so useful to students of royal life and so compelling to viewers is that it reveals something many people suspect but cannot always name. The British monarchy is not endangered only by grand scandal. It is endangered by blur, by the soft places where title meets commerce, where public identity meets private gain, where family history meets foreign influence, where charm disguises extraction. Michael was the Prince of Blur. He lived there so fluently that for years he may not even have recognized how alarming he looked to people outside his own world. In another family, in another class, blur can be shrugged off as networking. In monarchy, blur corrodes myth, and myth is the only reason monarchy survives. Strip away the uniforms, the churches, the ceremonies, the weddings, the funerals, the estates, the old names, and what remains is not hard power. It is theatrical legitimacy. The faith that these people, however privileged, still stand for something above ordinary buying and selling. Michael kept drifting back toward the ordinary marketplace, only he did it in exquisite gloves. That was what made him so dangerous symbolically. He suggested that the line between crown and commerce was not a sacred line after all, merely a matter of presentation. Once the public begins to think that way, every royal becomes harder to defend. That is why Michael's story echoed beyond his own rank. He was not central to the monarchy, but he was central to a certain kind of anxiety about the monarchy. The anxiety that lesser royals, left floating between palace and private life, become exactly the sort of figures modern institutions cannot afford. Neither accountable like public officials nor irrelevant like private citizens. Neither firmly salaried servants nor genuinely independent operators, but a hazy mixture of both. Michael did not invent that structural problem, but he embodied it so vividly that he became almost a case study in why the problem could no longer be ignored. And yet, for all that, one should resist the pleasure of simple condemnation. A life like his invites easy sneering, the grand rooms, the expensive assumptions, the wife who seemed to arrive from a lost continent of snobbery, the Russian fixations, the consultancy, the furtive air of money moving through historical costume. It is also easy to dislike, but if one stops there, one misses what gives the story its emotional force. Prince Michael was not just a warning. He was also a relic of a vanished royal psychology. He belonged to that generation raised to believe that breeding was a kind of moral architecture, that languages and lineage mattered, that one's role in the world should reflect one's birth, that aristocratic tact could solve things modern rules only complicated, and that history still had living claims on the present. Much of that world deserved to fade. Some of it deserved to be burned out entirely. But not all of it was cynical. In Michael, old assumptions mixed with genuine cultivation. He really did know things. He really did care about history. He really was formed by military discipline and dynastic memory. The tragedy is that he used those serious elements to support a life whose ethical outlines were never clear enough. So the very qualities that might have made him admirable became part of the distrust. His intelligence made him seem calculating. His historical seriousness made him seem vulnerable to old illusions of significance. His charm made him seem practiced in persuasion. His foreign knowledge made him seem available to foreign flattery. His princely dignity made his private arrangements look even less innocent. He could not lean on his gifts because his gifts themselves had become suspect. That is an awful place for any human being to end up. And then there is the family aspect, which should not be ignored in the rush to moral judgment. For all the public distrust, Michael remained deeply woven into a bloodline that does not truly know how to eject its own, unless absolutely forced. He appeared at the rites that matter. He mourned with them. He aged beside them. He watched younger generations rise while his own generation thinned out around him. He belonged not because people trusted him, but because blood is a stubborn thing in royal houses. That sort of belonging can be both mercy and punishment. You are never fully out, but you are never fully relied upon either. You become one of those figures who remind the family of what it would rather not see in itself. And what Michael reminded them of was uncomfortable indeed. He reminded them that glamour without function becomes temptation. He reminded them that lesser royals cannot be left to invent themselves without risk. He reminded them that aristocratic polish can be every bit as compromising as vulgar greed. He reminded them that the edges of monarchy are often where the rot begins, because the centre is protected by duty while the margins are seduced by freedom. That is a brutal truth, and the House of Windsor knows it now better than it once did. One can see in the slimmer modern monarchy Charles has long imagined the shadow of men like Michael. Fewer titled roamers, fewer vaguely defined cousins in palaces, fewer opportunities for the public to ask why a prince without a clear role still appears to live like a prince of consequence. Whatever one thinks of that smaller vision, Michael's life helped make it seem necessary. He was not the only reason, far from it, but he was one of the clearest examples of why the old sprawling model had become unsustainable. Every underdefined royal was a possible scandal waiting for a context. And Michael was a context magnet. He seemed always to drift toward whatever exposed the instability of his position. If race was the public wound of the hour, his household somehow found a way to prod it. If money and fairness were the pressure point, there he was, in the middle of a row about palace living. If foreign influence became a national anxiety, his Russian ties rose from romantic background to compromising foreground. If the question was what exactly a prince is allowed to sell, his own life offered a disturbingly practical answer. Seen that way, the phrase "the royal nobody trusted" becomes more than an insult. It becomes a diagnosis, not only of the man, but of the system that produced him. And yet diagnosis is not the same as final human meaning. Human meaning is always messier. What remains of Michael in the end is not simply the cautionary tale, though that is certainly part of it. What remains is the image of a man shaped by loss before memory, by glamour before purpose, by privilege before clarity, by old codes in a new age. A man who perhaps never entirely knew where his real self ended and his princely role began, because from childhood onward the two had been braided too tightly together. A man who could not bear insignificance, and so kept reaching for forms of significance that made others recoil. A man whose loyalty to his wife may have been one of his best qualities, and one of his worst public decisions at the same time. A man whose genuine cultivation became inseparable from the suspicion that he was always using it. That is not a monster's life. it is a deeply compromised one. And compromised lives are often the most revealing because they strip away the comfort of easy categories. Michael was not the family brute. He was not the family fool. He was not even the family pure victim. He was the family warning wrapped in velvet, the reminder that danger does not always arrive. Dirty and obvious. Sometimes it arrives in a tailored coat, speaking French and Russian, standing beautifully in a doorway, making everybody feel they are in the presence of history while quietly working out what history can still be worth. Perhaps that is why older audiences find him so fascinating. Not because he is lovable, and certainly not because he is innocent, but because he belongs to a type women of a certain age know all too well. The charming man who knows exactly how he appears. The well-mannered man who leaves confusion behind him like scent. The man whose wounds are real, whose intelligence is real, whose polish is real, and whose reliability is somehow still never quite there. Royalty only made the pattern grander. It did not make it less familiar. By the time his story settles into memory, that may be the lasting image. Not simply Prince Michael of Kent as a controversial royal cousin, not simply the husband of one of the family's most difficult women, not simply the prince with the Russian fixation and the awkward business life, but Prince Michael as the embodiment of a very particular truth. That trust is not destroyed only by open wickedness. It is also destroyed by a life that keeps placing itself just beyond the point where innocence can still be believed. He looked like a prince people should have trusted. That was the beauty of him and the danger. And in the end, that was exactly why they did not.